In the dark hours of a January night in 1995, an 18-year-old girl walked across the grounds of a Tennessee Job Corps campus, 3 people beside her. Her name was Colleen Slemmer. Within hours, she would be dead, tortured, beaten, and murdered by someone she thought was her friend. The killer kept a piece of Colleen's skull as a trophy, carrying it in her pocket like a memento. That killer was Christa Gale Pike, just 18 years old herself. 1 year later, she would become the youngest woman sentenced to death in the United States. Tennessee has not executed a woman in over 2 centuries. Nearly 30 years after that brutal night, Christa Pike still sits on death row, and the question remains, will the state of Tennessee finally break its 200-year streak? This case has everything. A childhood marked by unspeakable trauma, a teenage obsession that spiraled into deadly jealousy, a murder so brutal that seasoned investigators struggled to comprehend it, and at the center of it all, a young woman whose life seemed destined for tragedy from the very beginning. But destiny doesn't pull the trigger, people do, and Christa Pike made choices that January night that sealed not just Colleen Slemmer's fate, but her own. Let me take you back to where this story really begins, long before that night in Knoxville, long before Job Corps, long before murder. We need to go back to 1976, to a little girl born into circumstances that would have broken most people before they even had a chance to grow up. Christa Gale Pike was born in 1976 into a family that couldn't provide what any child needs most: safety, stability, and love. Her parents were largely absent, both physically and emotionally. When they were around, they were distant, uninvolved, checked out in ways that left Christa feeling invisible. Her parents were divorced. Her father had another family and wanted nothing to do with her. Her mother was an alcoholic and cared more about the alcohol than her daughter. The only person who showed her genuine affection, the only person who made her feel like she mattered, was her grandmother. Although she was abused by her grandmother's boyfriend, he was thrown out of the picture when she found out what had been happening to her granddaughter. In a childhood marked by neglect and chaos, her grandmother became everything, the one anchor in a storm that never seemed to end. Then her grandmother died. For Christa, the loss was devastating. Friends and family members would later say that her grandmother's death turned her world upside down. The one source of unconditional love, gone. And what rushed in to fill that void was darkness. She had to move back into her mother's house. Without that stabilizing presence, without someone to tell her she was valued, Christa began to drift into dangerous territory. But the absence of love was only part of the story. The presence of violence was the other. Christa experienced physical abuse as a child. She was also sexually assaulted, experiences that left deep psychological scars. These weren't isolated incidents. They were patterns, repeated violations that taught her the world was a cruel, dangerous place where people hurt you, used you, and threw you away. For a developing mind, that kind of trauma rewires everything. Trust becomes impossible. Anger becomes constant. And pain, inflicted or received, starts to feel normal. Despite all of this, people who knew her described her as charismatic, socially engaging, someone who could draw others in when she wanted to. But beneath that surface charm was a deep instability, an unpredictability that made her relationships volatile. She could be your best friend one moment and your worst enemy the next. That kind of emotional whiplash kept people off balance, never quite sure which version of Christa they were dealing with. By her early teens, Christa had dropped out of school. Education felt pointless when survival felt impossible. She turned to alcohol and drugs, self-medicating the pain that no one else seemed to acknowledge or care about. Her substance use wasn't recreational. It was desperate, a way to numb feelings that threatened to consume her. And as she sank deeper into that self-destructive spiral, she became increasingly defiant and isolated. She started running with the wrong crowds, kids who were just as lost as she was, just as angry, just as willing to break rules. because rules had never protected them. These early encounters with delinquency were minor at first. Small acts of rebellion, petty crimes, the kind of stuff troubled teenagers get into. But they established a pattern, a trajectory that was pointing toward something darker. By the time Christa Pike enrolled in Job Corps in the early 1990s, she was carrying more baggage than most people accumulate in a lifetime. Job Corps was supposed to be a fresh start, a vocational program designed to give young people like Christa the skills and structure they needed to build independent lives. For many participants, it worked. They learned trades, earned their GEDs, found paths forward. But for Christa, Job Corps became something else entirely. It became the place where all those years of trauma, anger, and instability would finally explode. The Job Corps campus in Knoxville, Tennessee, was home to hundreds of young people, all trying to figure out their futures. Some took it seriously. Others treated it like an extended social scene. Christa fell somewhere in between. She was there, she participated, but she was also drawn to the more chaotic elements of campus life. The kids who partied too hard, who broke curfew, who pushed boundaries. In that environment, Christa found a sense of belonging she hadn't felt since her grandmother died. And then she met Tatterell Shipp. Tatterell Shipp was 17 years old and grew up in Memphis, Tennessee. He was raised by his mother, a single parent, and life in their household was far from easy. Like Christa Pike, Tatterell dropped out of high school in the 9th grade. After leaving school, he became involved in criminal activities and joined a local gang, which worried his mother deeply. Recognizing that her son was heading down a dangerous path, she encouraged him to enroll in the Job Corps program to gain skills, complete his education, and find employment. Tatterell followed her advice and joined Job Corps in the fall of 1994, coinciding with Christa Pike's enrollment. When Tatterell first encountered Christa on the Job Corps campus, he claimed it was love at first sight. He approached her, telling her they were meant to be together, because he had dreamed of her the night before. To make his story more compelling, he had a friend draw a picture of the girl from his dream, which closely resembled Christa. Though skeptical at first, Christa was enchanted by the gesture, viewing it as a romantic fairy tale-like moment. Their relationship quickly became intense and all-consuming, with both teenagers completely captivated by one another. A significant aspect of their bond involved Tatterell introducing Christa to his fascination with Satanism and the occult. In his dorm room, he maintained what was described as a satanic shrine and spent time teaching Christa about his interests. While documentaries often emphasize this element to portray the pair as devil worshippers, further examination suggests that Tatterell, like many teenagers, was exploring darker subjects as a form of rebellion or curiosity. His interest in the occult was extreme for his age, but it was also intertwined with his personality, rather than being an outright expression of deep-rooted evil. Tatterell also had a notorious reputation for violence at the Job Corps campus. He was intimidating to other students, to the point that many admitted being genuinely scared of him. On one occasion, when a student accidentally bumped into Christa, Tatterell reacted aggressively, grabbing the student by the throat, slamming him into a wall, and brandishing a razor blade to threaten him. He made it clear that anyone who harmed or approached Christa would face consequences. Christa reportedly admired this side of him, appreciating that Tatterell would fiercely protect her. Their relationship was a volatile mix of devotion, obsession, and exposure to extreme behaviors that would later influence the tragic events at Job Corps. Christa's feelings for Tatterell weren't just intense, they were dangerous. She needed to control him, to own him, to make sure no one else could have his attention. Their relationship was toxic from the start, fueled by jealousy and a twisted sense of loyalty. Christa made it clear to everyone around her that Tatterell was hers, and anyone who threatened that bond, real or imagined, was making an enemy. The dynamics of their relationship revealed something crucial about Christa. She wasn't just passively shaped by her circumstances anymore. She was making active, deliberate choices driven by possessiveness and rage. Colleen Slemmer was born on September 20th, 1975, and grew up in Orange Park, Florida, living with her mother, stepfather, and younger sister. From an early age, she was described as friendly, loving, and deeply connected to her family and friends. Colleen developed a passion for computers and showed an early aptitude for learning, excelling in school and demonstrating curiosity and drive in her interests. Despite her academic potential, Colleen faced challenges in ninth grade, struggling with a learning disability that ultimately led her to drop out of high school. Following this, she held several jobs, including positions at Wendy's and Taco Bell, but she aspired for more from life. Her passion for computers and desire to further her education motivated her to seek new opportunities beyond her immediate environment. At the age of 19, Colleen decided to re-enter education by enrolling in the computer training program at Job Corps in Knoxville, Tennessee, beginning in the fall semester of 1994. Her initial months at Job Corps were positive, and she appeared to be thriving academically and socially. However, a few weeks into the program, Colleen's first encounter with Christa Pike did not go smoothly, setting in motion the events that would tragically change the course of her life. Colleen Slemmer came to Job Corps with goals, genuinely trying to better herself. By all accounts, she was a good person, someone who didn't deserve what was about to happen to her. But in Christa's mind, Colleen had become a problem. It was reported that Tadaryl was making moves toward Colleen, and Christa hated her for wanting to steal her boyfriend. At Job Corps, Christa's behavior had been escalating. She had started showing increasingly aggressive tendencies toward other students. Intimidation, verbal threats, minor physical altercations. She was testing boundaries, seeing what she could get away with, establishing dominance in the social hierarchy. These weren't random outbursts. They were calculated displays of power, and they worked. People started fearing her, giving her a wide berth, treating her with the kind of wary respect you give someone unpredictable and potentially violent. But intimidation wasn't enough anymore. Christa wanted to send a message that couldn't be ignored, couldn't be misunderstood, and she wanted Colleen Slemmer to be that message. The planning began weeks before the murder. Christa didn't wake up one morning and impulsively decide to kill someone. She thought about it. She talked about it. She recruited help. This was premeditated, carefully orchestrated, done with full awareness of what she intended to do and what the consequences would be. She enlisted the help of Tadaryl Shipp and another student, Shadala Peterson. Each would play a role in what was about to unfold. On the night of January 12, 1995, Christa put her plan into motion. She approached Colleen with a story, a reason to leave the dormitory and walk across campus. Colleen, unsuspecting, agreed. They walked together into the darkness, away from the buildings, away from potential witnesses, toward an isolated area of the campus grounds. Colleen probably didn't realize anything was wrong until it was too late. What happened next lasted approximately 45 minutes, though those minutes must have felt like an eternity for Colleen Slemmer. The attack began with verbal abuse, psychological torture designed to terrify and disorient. Then came the physical violence, beatings, repeated blows, pain inflicted with deliberate cruelty. This wasn't a quick murder. This wasn't a crime of passion where anger flares and someone acts without thinking. This was sustained, methodical torture. Christa Pike didn't just want Colleen dead. She wanted her to suffer. She wanted her to know fear, to feel helpless, to understand that she had been chosen for this. The brutality escalated as the attack continued. Colleen was beaten so severely that her injuries would shock even experienced investigators. But Christa wasn't finished. At some point during the torture, a pentagram was carved into Colleen's chest. The symbol, often associated with Satanism or occult practices, added another layer of horror to an already unspeakable crime. Whether Christa believed in any occult significance or simply wanted to make the murder more shocking, more theatrical, we don't know. What we do know is that it demonstrated a level of sadistic creativity that went beyond simple violence. And then, when Colleen Slemmer was finally dead, when her body lay broken on the cold Tennessee ground, Christa Pike did something that would define her case forever. She took a piece of Colleen's skull. Using a knife or sharp object, she removed a fragment of bone from Colleen's head. She kept it as a trophy, a souvenir of what she had done. She would later carry it in her pocket, show it to people, brag about the murder. That piece of skull became the most damning piece of evidence against her. Physical proof not just of the murder but of the psychological state that made such an act possible. Keeping a trophy from a victim is a hallmark of certain types of killers. Serial killers, sadists, people who derive ongoing satisfaction from reliving their crimes. It demonstrates a complete absence of empathy, a total moral disengagement from the humanity of the victim. Colleen Slemmer wasn't a person to Christa Pike anymore. She was a possession, a conquest, a story to tell. Before we continue with what happens next, I want to ask you something. Where are you watching this from? Drop your location in the comments. And if you've made it this far into this story, comment below and let me know. I want to see who's still here, following this case with me. The investigation moved quickly. Colleen Slemmer was reported missing shortly after she failed to return to her dormitory. When her body was discovered on the Job Corps campus, the brutality of the crime immediately elevated it to top priority. Law enforcement began interviewing students, piecing together Colleen's final hours, identifying who had been with her last. Witnesses came forward. People had seen Christa, Tadarl, and Shadala leaving with Colleen that night. Others reported that Christa had been talking about wanting to hurt Colleen in the days leading up to the murder. The evidence piled up rapidly. Physical evidence from the scene connected the suspects to the location. And then there were the confessions. Under questioning, the truth came spilling out. The roles each person had played, the planning that had gone into it, the details of what had been done to Colleen. But perhaps the most damning evidence was that piece of skull. When investigators learned that Christa had kept it, had been showing it to people, bragging about the murder, the case became airtight. This wasn't a situation where defendants could claim self-defense or accident or diminished capacity. This was clear, premeditated, first-degree murder with aggravating factors that made it eligible for the death penalty. Christa Pike was arrested and charged with first-degree murder. The prosecution also brought charges of conspiracy to commit murder and aggravated kidnapping. Tadarl Shipp faced similar charges. Shadala Peterson, who had played a lesser role, was charged as well, but would ultimately receive a more lenient sentence in exchange for her testimony against the others. The trial began in 1996. Christa was 19 years old when she sat in that courtroom, facing the possibility of execution. The prosecution laid out their case methodically. They presented the evidence of planning, the witness testimony, the physical evidence from the crime scene. They showed the jury the piece of skull that Christa had kept, explained its significance, made it clear that this was not the act of someone who had lost control or acted impulsively. This was the work of someone who knew exactly what she was doing and enjoyed it. The defense attempted to introduce evidence of Christa's traumatic childhood, the abuse she had suffered, the instability of her upbringing. They argued for mitigation, suggesting that while Christa was responsible for her actions, the jury should consider the context of her life when deciding her sentence. But the prosecution countered effectively. They acknowledged that Christa had experienced trauma, but they argued that trauma doesn't erase moral responsibility. Millions of people suffer abuse and don't become murderers. Christa Pike had made a choice, a deliberate, calculated choice to torture and kill another human being. The jury deliberated and returned with their verdict. Guilty on all counts. Then came the penalty phase, where the same jury would decide whether Christa Pike should receive life in prison or death. They heard more about her background, more about the crime itself, more about the victim Colleen Slemmer had been. And then they made their decision. Christa Gale Pike was sentenced to death. At 19 years old, she became the youngest woman on death row in the United States. The sentence sent shockwaves through Tennessee and beyond. The brutality of the crime, the youth of both victim and perpetrator, the gender dynamics of sentencing a woman to death all combined to make this case a national story. Tadarl Shipp was convicted as well because he had assisted in the torture and murder of Colleen, but received a sentence of life imprisonment with the possibility of parole. The disparity in sentencing raised questions about Christa's role in the crime and whether gender bias had worked against her. Some argued she had been the ringleader and deserved the harsher sentence. Others suggested that stereotypes about violent women, the shock of a female killer, had made the jury more willing to impose death. Shadala Peterson received 6 years of probation after testifying against Christa and Tadariel. Her cooperation with prosecutors and her lesser role in the actual murder earned her leniency, though she would carry the weight of that night for the rest of her life. For Colleen Slemmer's family, the convictions brought some measure of justice, but no real closure. Their daughter was gone, murdered in one of the most brutal ways imaginable. No sentence could bring her back. No punishment could undo what had been done. But at least there was accountability. At least the people responsible would face consequences. Except those consequences kept getting delayed. Christa Pike's case entered the appeals process, and it would remain there for decades. Her attorneys filed motion after motion, challenging various aspects of the trial, the evidence, the sentencing. Some appeals focused on procedural issues. Others raised questions about Christa's mental competency at the time of the crime and during the trial. Still others argued that the death penalty itself was unconstitutional, or that it was applied arbitrarily. The appeals dragged on year after year. Each motion, each hearing, each legal maneuver pushed the execution date further into the future. For Colleen's family, the delays were agonizing. They had been told justice would be served, but nearly 3 decades later, Christa Pike was still alive, still on death row, still fighting her sentence. The legal system, designed to protect the rights of the accused, felt to them like a betrayal, a broken promise. Public frustration grew as well. Tennessee taxpayers were funding Christa's incarceration, her appeals, the endless legal proceedings. The case became a focal point in debates about the death penalty, about the appeals process, about whether justice delayed is justice denied. But understanding Christa Pike's case requires going deeper than just the facts of the crime and the legal proceedings. We need to examine the psychology behind what she did, the factors that shaped her into someone capable of such extreme violence. And we need to do so without excusing her actions, because understanding is not the same as forgiveness. Christa's childhood trauma was real and severe. The abuse she suffered, both physical and sexual, would have lasting impacts on her emotional development and her ability to form healthy relationships. Research in developmental psychology and neuroscience has shown that childhood trauma, especially when prolonged and severe, can alter brain development. The areas responsible for emotional regulation, impulse control, and empathy can be affected, making it harder for trauma survivors to manage their emotions and connect with others. Christa's substance abuse problems compounded these issues. Alcohol and drugs further impaired her judgment and lowered her inhibitions. When you combine a trauma-damaged psyche with substance abuse and a toxic relationship dynamic, you create a situation where violence becomes increasingly likely. But likely doesn't mean inevitable. Millions of people have experienced childhood trauma. Many struggle with substance abuse. Many end up in unhealthy relationships. The vast majority don't become murderers. What set Christa apart wasn't just her history. It was her choices, and what those choices revealed about her psychological makeup. The trophy-keeping behavior is particularly revealing. Taking and keeping a piece of Colleen's skull wasn't a trauma response. It wasn't something she did while intoxicated or in an emotional state. It was a deliberate act that demonstrated several disturbing traits. First, it showed a complete lack of empathy. Christa couldn't or wouldn't see Colleen as a human being with her own life, her own value, her own right to exist. Colleen had become an object, a thing to be used and discarded. Second, it demonstrated psychopathic traits. The ability to inflict prolonged torture, to derive satisfaction from another person's suffering, to keep a trophy as a reminder of that suffering, these are hallmarks of psychopathy. Third, it revealed moral disengagement. Christa had disconnected herself from any sense of right and wrong, any internal moral compass that might have stopped her. The premeditation was another crucial factor. This wasn't a spontaneous act. Christa planned this murder. She thought about it, prepared for it, recruited accomplices, lured Colleen to an isolated location. Every step of that process involved decisions, moments where she could have stopped, could have reconsidered, could have chosen differently. She didn't. She moved forward deliberately, fully aware of what she intended to do. Some psychologists who have examined the case have suggested that Christa exhibits traits consistent with antisocial personality disorder, possibly with psychopathic features. Others have pointed to borderline personality disorder, given her intense, unstable relationships and fear of abandonment. Still others have emphasized the role of post-traumatic stress disorder and how unresolved trauma can manifest in violence. The truth is probably some combination of all these factors. Christa Pike is a complicated case, a person shaped by terrible circumstances who made terrible choices. Her trauma explains some of her emotional instability and her difficulties forming healthy attachments. But it doesn't explain the sadism, the trophy-keeping, the complete absence of remorse. Those traits suggest something deeper, something that might have been there regardless of her childhood experiences. And that brings us to one of the most difficult questions in criminal justice. How much should we consider someone's background when determining their punishment? If we believe that people are shaped by their experiences, that childhood trauma and abuse can fundamentally alter a person's psychological development, then shouldn't that matter when we're deciding whether to execute them? But if we go too far in that direction, do we risk excusing behavior that should never be excused? Do we take away the agency and responsibility that makes us human? These questions have been central to the public debate surrounding Christa Pike's case. Some people argue that her death sentence is appropriate given the brutality of the crime and the complete lack of remorse she has shown. They point to the premeditation, the torture, the trophy-keeping, as evidence that she deserves the ultimate punishment. They argue that Colleen Slemmer's life had value, that her death demands justice, and that justice in this case means execution. Others argue that executing Christa would be wrong, not because what she did wasn't horrific, but because the death penalty itself is problematic. They point to the arbitrariness of its application, the fact that similar crimes sometimes result in life sentences and sometimes in death depending on factors that have nothing to do with the crime itself. They note that Christa's gender, her youth at the time of the crime, and her traumatic background should all be mitigating factors. They argue that life imprisonment without parole would be sufficient punishment and would avoid the ethical complications of state-sanctioned execution. There's also a gender dimension to this debate that can't be ignored. Women are rarely sentenced to death in the United States. When they are, it often involves crimes against children, or particularly brutal murders that violate societal expectations about female behavior. Some researchers have suggested that women who commit violent crimes face a kind of double judgment. They're punished for the crime itself, but also for violating gender norms, for being violent when women are supposed to be nurturing, for being aggressive when women are supposed to be passive. Christa Pike's case fits this pattern. The brutality of what she did, the fact that she was the apparent ringleader, the trophy-keeping, all of these violated expectations about how women behave. And some argue that violation of gender norms made the jury more willing to impose death. Others counter that this argument itself is sexist, that it implies women shouldn't be held to the same standards of accountability as men, that suggesting Christa received death because she's female takes away her agency and responsibility just as much as blaming her crimes solely on her trauma. As the years passed and the appeals continued, public interest in the case waxed and waned. Sometimes it surged back into the headlines when a new appeal was filed or when execution dates were set and then stayed. Other times it faded into the background, just another death row case in a system full of them. But for those directly affected, Colleen's family and friends, the case never faded. Their pain never went away. Colleen was frozen in time for them, forever 19, forever the girl who walked into the darkness and never came back. They attended hearings when they could, made victim impact statements, reminded the courts and the public that this wasn't just about Christa Pike and her rights. It was about Colleen Slemmer and the life that was stolen from her. Tennessee's relationship with the death penalty adds another layer of complexity to this case. The state has a long history of capital punishment, but executions have been relatively rare in recent decades. More significantly, Tennessee has not executed a woman in over 200 years. The last woman executed in the state was in the early 1800s, so if Christa Pike's execution is carried out, it would be a historic event, the breaking of a 2-century streak. That historical context has influenced the debate around her case. Some see it as evidence that the state should commute her sentence, arguing that the long gap in executing women suggests societal recognition that executing women is different, more troubling somehow. Others see it as irrelevant, arguing that the crime should determine the punishment, not the gender of the perpetrator or historical execution patterns. The method of execution has also been a point of contention. Tennessee law allows condemned inmates to choose between lethal injection and electrocution. If no choice is made, lethal injection is the default. Both methods have been challenged as cruel and unusual punishment, with legal battles over drug protocols for lethal injection and the reliability and humaneness of the electric chair. Christa has not publicly stated a preference, and given the ongoing appeals, the question of method remains somewhat academic. Before there can be a method, there must be an execution date that actually happens. Currently, Christa Pike remains on death row in Tennessee. She has spent more time awaiting execution than she spent free as an adult. She was 19 when she was sentenced. She is now in her late 40s. Nearly her entire adult life has been spent in a small cell, awaiting a death that has been promised but never delivered. The conditions of death row are harsh by design. Extended isolation, limited human contact, the psychological weight of knowing you've been condemned to die but not knowing when. Some death row inmates describe it as a kind of torture in itself, a slow psychological deterioration that happens over years and decades. Whether Christa Pike has experienced remorse during those years, whether she has reflected on what she did and felt genuine regret, we don't know. She has given few interviews and made few public statements. What we do know is that Colleen Slemmer's family continues to wait. They have waited through appeals, through stays of execution, through legal maneuvers that have stretched on for decades. They have watched as the legal system prioritized the rights of their daughter's killer over their need for closure. And they have wondered whether they will ever see the sentence carried out, or whether Christa Pike will die of old age on death row, the death penalty technically imposed but never executed. The case has implications beyond just Christa Pike and Colleen Slemmer. It has become a touchstone in broader debates about criminal justice, about how we treat juvenile and young adult offenders, about the role of trauma in criminal behavior, about gender and punishment, about the death penalty itself. Law schools study the case. Criminal justice programs examine it. Psychologists analyze it, and people across the country debate it, arguing about justice and mercy, accountability and compassion, punishment and rehabilitation. Some of those debates focus on practical questions. Does the death penalty actually serve as a deterrent to violent crime? Research on this question has been mixed, with some studies suggesting no deterrent effect and others claiming to find one. Does it provide closure to victims' families? Again, the evidence is complicated. Some families of murder victims report that executions help them move forward. Others say it didn't change anything, that their loved one was still gone regardless of what happened to the killer. There are also questions about cost. Contrary to popular belief, death penalty cases are often more expensive than life imprisonment cases due to the extensive appeals process and the additional security measures required for death row inmates. In Christa Pike's case, Tennessee taxpayers have funded nearly 30 years of incarceration and legal proceedings. Would that money have been better spent elsewhere? And there are questions about accuracy. The criminal justice system is run by humans, and humans make mistakes. Since the reinstatement of the death penalty in the United States in 1976, more than 180 people have been exonerated from death row, found innocent after being convicted and sentenced to death. That error rate is troubling. Once an execution is carried out, it cannot be undone. If we later discover that the person was innocent, there is no remedy, no way to make it right. In Christa Pike's case, there is no question of factual innocence. The evidence of her guilt is overwhelming. She participated in the murder, kept the trophy, confessed to details. No one seriously argues that she didn't do it. The questions in her case are about mitigation, about whether her youth, her trauma, her possible mental illness should have resulted in a different sentence. Those are important questions, but they're different from questions about guilt or innocence. Christa Pike was a child who suffered terribly and became an adult who inflicted suffering. Colleen Slemmer was a young woman trying to build a better life who had that life violently stolen. The criminal justice system promised accountability, but has delivered decades of delays. Society demands justice but can't agree on what justice looks like. There are no easy answers here. This isn't a case where we can point to one factor and say that's why it happened, that's what went wrong, that's what we need to fix. This is a case where multiple failures, multiple tragedies, multiple bad decisions all collided in the worst possible way. Christa Pike's childhood was a failure. The systems that should have protected her didn't. The adults who should have cared for her didn't. The interventions that should have happened before she became violent didn't. But those failures don't erase her responsibility for what she did. She tortured and murdered another human being. She kept a piece of her victim's skull as a trophy. She showed no remorse. Those actions were hers, choices she made, crimes she committed. Colleen Slemmer deserved better. She deserved to finish job course, to pursue her goals, to live her life. She deserved to grow old, to fall in love, to have experiences and adventures and all the normal joys and sorrows of human existence. She deserved not to die terrified and in pain on a cold January night. Her life had value, and that value was destroyed. The question that haunts this case, the question that Tennessee will eventually have to answer, is whether executing Christa Pike serves any meaningful purpose. Does it honor Colleen's memory? Does it deter future violence? Does it make society safer? Does it provide closure? Or does it just add another death to a tragedy that already has too much death? Reasonable people disagree on these questions. Some believe strongly that Christa Pike deserves to die for what she did, that anything less would be a betrayal of Colleen Slemmer and an insult to the concept of justice. Others believe just as strongly that executing Christa would be wrong, that it would make society complicit in violence, that it would accomplish nothing positive and would represent a failure of our highest moral aspirations. What we can say with certainty is that this case represents an intersection of some of the most difficult issues in criminal justice: trauma and accountability, youth and culpability, gender and sentencing, the death penalty and its application, mental illness and moral responsibility. None of these issues have simple solutions, and Christa Pike's case doesn't provide any. What it does provide is a stark reminder of how violence ripples outward, affecting not just the immediate victim, but families, communities, and society at large. Colleen Slemmer's family has lived with grief for nearly 3 decades. Christa Pike's family, whatever relationship she maintained with them, has lived with shame and loss. The other Job Corps students who were there that year had their sense of safety shattered. The investigators and prosecutors who worked the case carry those images with them. The jury members who sentenced a 19-year-old woman to death carry that weight. And we, as a society, carry the question of what justice means, what punishment accomplishes, and how we balance our desire for accountability with our capacity for mercy. Christa Pike's case forces us to confront those questions directly, to examine our beliefs about crime and punishment, to consider what we owe to victims and what we owe to offenders, to think about the kind of society we want to be. What other cases do you want covered? What stories do you think need to be told? Drop your suggestions in the comments below. And if this case affected you, if it made you think or feel something, let me know. These stories matter. These lives matter. And the conversations we have about them matter too. Tennessee still hasn't executed a woman in over 200 years. Christa Pike sits on death row, her appeals ongoing, her fate uncertain. Colleen Slemmer's grave has been visited by family members for nearly 3 decades, her life remembered, her death never forgotten. And the rest of us watch and wait and argue about what should happen next.